Good afternoon and welcome to the Routes and Schedules meeting. We're going to go ahead and get started here for the sake of time. I know everyone probably has other things they want to do with their beautiful Saturday. So we're going to dive in, and before we do that, a couple housekeeping items. We do have live transcripts going, so you can turn those on or off using the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. We've got a interactive activity plan for today. We'll share the link to that towards the end. That does work best off of a desktop. So if you're using mobile, you might have a little trouble with that, but just save the link and you can check it later. It'll be available for at least another week. So with that, we'll kind of do quick introductions on the Metro side. My name's Evan Schweitz, and I'm the senior planner here at Metro.
Hi, I'm Annie Pagaga. I'm the communications specialist at Metro.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Sensick. I'm the CEO of Metro Transit. As we're about to kick off here, I just wanted to say a few words and say we really appreciate everybody's time. I think you get double points for showing up on a Saturday. It's, that potentially overlaps with the Husker game, but it's really exciting to have this conversation with the community. We're very interested in hearing feedback and really having that feedback shape this plan. So Evan will talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but MetroNEXT is really a year-long strategic planning effort that we're undertaking to really look at all aspects of our service, from where our routes go and how often they run to what the customer experience is like, and really trying to set the stage for where we want to grow and what we want to look like, not just tomorrow, but 5 years, 10 years into the future. So some of these things that we're talking about are a little bit visionary and will require some additional resources to pull off, but it's really important that we set that roadmap for where we're headed. And so we're really excited to have you here. Please feel free to put comments in the chat and really share your thoughts overall as we go through this process. There will be places where we stop and ask questions and things too, but thank you so much for being here.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, just to jump in. So again, the MetroNEXT process has been underway this full year. Starting back in the spring, we had a first set of meetings for understanding the landscape, and that conversation was really about looking at the big picture of our city, how it's changing as we move forward, and then some of the other dynamics that influence the service that we offer and our plans for the future. So right now we're kind of in this middle phase of framing the transit network and supporting additional connections. So we wanted to kind of drill into the topics that we hear most about from our customers and do separate sessions on each of those so that people can kind of pick and choose what's important to them and have a little bit deeper level conversations on each topic. So that's where we are right now. And after this whole series is completed, then we'll be taking that feedback into shaping the final plan, and we'll bring that back for public comment next year. As I mentioned, we had a couple different topics to choose from. We're on the topic of routes and schedules today, Saturday, November 20th. So we did have a meeting on this same topic on Wednesday of this week. The next set of meetings will be on our rapid transit network, and that will happen after Thanksgiving. We do have additional meetings planned as we lead into December on fare payments and policies and new types of service. So just stay tuned for that as well. So the topic today, routes and schedules, is really drilling into the thing that we hear about all the time from customers in terms of where our routes should go, how often the buses should arrive, and then what days of the week or what times of day they should operate. And so to understand a little bit of the context behind that, I've prepared a few slides that we can discuss a little further. So one thing to know, and we shared this in earlier meetings as well, is that in Omaha, our level of transit spending per capita is $40 per person per year. And so if you compare that to a lot of other cities our size, for example, Lincoln smaller city than us, but they spend $55 per person on transit. So that really allows them to offer a higher level of service per person than what we can accomplish here. And then as you go down the line, Kansas City, Des Moines, even Minneapolis are cities that people will hear about in the Midwest and say, we would love for Metro to be more like the service that we rode in these other places. And part of the challenge with delivering that level of service is identifying that level of funding. So I also wanted to mention the impacts of COVID-19, because as we all know, that has kind of turned upside down just about every industry over the past year and a half, and transit is no different. So we've started early in the pandemic doing extensive cleaning and safety measures, which we've retained all throughout this process to make sure that our vehicles are safe and people can continue to rely on us. We're prioritizing transportation of essential workers and those seeking critical services. So some of our routes are still operating on a fairly reduced schedule, but those routes that are serving those critical service areas or where we've seen ridership stay pretty active throughout the pandemic, we've tried to preserve service on those lines. System-wide, our passenger counts are down about 40% still, but individual routes are impacted either higher or lower than that average. Just to kind of dive into those numbers a little bit, the area where we still see the highest decline in ridership is our express routes. And those are park and rides that kind of serve the perimeter of our region and offer weekday trips during rush hour into downtown. And so those expresses on average are down 77% over pre-COVID ridership. And then as you look here at the other types of service, we've got our paratransit, our local routes, and our core routes that are all down about 45 to 50%. Weekends, we're not seeing as much of a decline, and I'll get to that a little bit more on the next slide. The one exception is actually our orbit line, which is up compared to the number of people that were riding Route 2 before the pandemic started. And so these numbers are from January of 2021, and the weekday number was not quite above Route 2 levels, but that has since changed into the fall. So this, if we were to update this chart, all three of these would be positive. So that's kind of the standalone route that's really performed well and kind of recovered already from pandemic. This slide here shows a comparison of October 2019, so well before the pandemic, to October of this year, 2021. And something really interesting that we're keeping an eye on is we've seen 6% more ridership on the weekends than before. So this is when factoring all of our routes together. It's really our weekday service that has been most disrupted by COVID. Our weekend ridership is stable. So as we consider what routes should run on which days of the week, that's another layer of the information that we're looking at. The other thing that we did earlier in the MetroNEXT process was kind of create a map that shows ridership potential for the whole region. And there's lots of different data sources that went into calculating and producing that map. And so some of those layers are the number of residents in an area, the number of destinations, including essential services, and some of those other critical locations that we know are going to be strong trip generators in the future. And then we also looked at household characteristics for the people in a neighborhood, if they're low income or minority, or have a disability or limited access to a vehicle. Those are all factors that would cause someone to ride transit more than the average person. So we want to be sure to include those as we look at our region. Then we also looked at the built environment, because locations without sidewalks can be much more difficult to serve with transit. So when you add up all of those items together, that's what produces this map. And so we've categorized every little half-mile grid of our region into low, medium, or high suitability for transit. And so it really helps us understand the potential and kind of what tools and what levels of service would be most appropriate for a different neighborhood. So as we approach how to design our network of routes, there's kind of two different ends of the spectrum in terms of what we could offer. On one end of the spectrum is coverage-based service, which is really trying to provide basic levels of transit service to the entire city. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a frequency-based model, and that focuses our resources only where ridership potential is highest. So if you can picture back to this map, a coverage model would try to offer service to all of these gold areas, including Springfield, Gretna, Waterloo Valley, Bennington. So the service that we offer might be pretty limited, but at least we could say that we covered every place that has low or any signs of transit suitability. But because of that, typically people are going to have to plan their day around the transit schedule, and it's going to be a system that works less for the average person. So ridership on these types of networks tends to be lower, just because it's not useful to people unless they have no other option and are kind of planning their day around it. And then again, back to the frequency end of the spectrum, the solid red color. If we were approaching our system design from that end, we would really concentrate our routes in the areas on this map that are red. And so if you lived in one of those neighborhoods, you could show up anytime to your bus stop and know that a bus is not far away. Those types of systems tend to generate high ridership. But obviously, if you look at our region, there aren't many areas that show in that red color. So it would leave quite a few people with no service. But for those that are in the red areas, they're going to have excellent transit service, maybe even 24/7. So those two are kind of extremes that we wouldn't actually do for our service area. But I explain this all as an illustration to show that the whole line makes up a spectrum. And so our job with the public as well is to kind of figure out where on that spectrum do we want to land with our service? Do we want to be more on the coverage side or more on the frequency side? And then what are the trade-offs with that? Because we don't have an unlimited budget, so we have to say no, and we have to kind of stop somewhere in terms of how much transit service we offer. So just kind of like spitballing where I think we are, I think we're pretty close to the center, but maybe a little bit more on the coverage side of things. So we still hear from quite a few people that the schedules that are near them are not very suitable to their lifestyle. It causes them to wait more than they'd like. But we also hear from people that can't get to certain areas of the region. So that's kind of why I put us a little bit more on that end. But also over the past few years, we've got service standards in place that are helping us to evolve. So every time we make minor adjustments to our schedule, we're looking for ways to add back service in the places that people are riding it, which is kind of pushing us down that spectrum towards a frequency-based model. So before we go too much further, any questions or comments after that description? Anything that anyone wants to share?
So while people are putting their comments in the chat, I'll just say, there's a lot of other things that we think about in sort of this coverage versus frequency. Clearly we want to be able to get people where they need to go and make that trip as most efficient as possible. But we're also looking at a lot of other pieces, including equity, right? So there are areas of town where we really are trying to prioritize putting services for a number of other reasons. And so there's a lot of factors that go into sort of this coverage versus frequency description that I think it's really important to think about as a part of the bigger picture. So it's not quite on coverage versus frequency, but we do have a question in the chat that I think we can pause and address. Billy asked, what about winter services for snowplows at the bus stops, and especially for the disabled individuals? So Billy, I think that's a great question and something that, we're not really focusing on in terms of the conversation about where our route should go today. But I think your point is so valid that we're looking at MetroNEXT as the whole of the customer experience, right? So not just where our routes go and how often they come, but what is it like to actually ride the bus? And so that's a really key piece of it. Not only, snow plows, but where the shelters are, what is it like to wait at the bus stop? And so those are all areas that we're trying to address through MetroNEXT. The way it currently works is that we have about 2,000 bus stops throughout the city, and about 50 some bus shelters. So Metro pays for plowing and shoveling and removal of snow at all of our transit centers and our bus shelters, but not at the individual stops. Those are all on either public right of way or private right of way. They're not owned by Metro. So we really rely on neighbors to help shovel in those areas. And we do everything we can to clear in the bus shelters that we own. But I think that is such an important part of what it's like to ride the bus, and something that, we certainly want to work with the community and with stakeholders to improve that experience overall.
Billy, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. Let's make sure that we've answered your question. It looks like maybe you have more to say.
Yeah, I was wondering is you were saying I was saying, is that the city's problem, because you had mentioned it, that somebody else do it, or sometimes the residents and other people might do it, or help out with the snow plow as far as the bus stops, because they used to do it, but they have not done it in a while because they have so many other things that they have to do. Depending on the storms and blizzards and stuff, and getting on that bus. And I have a scooter, so it's been really hard for me one winter time,
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering about that snow plow at individual bus stops that she was speaking of. Do I need to talk to like my mayor or the governor about that, or should I? I was wondering if there was a city more.
Yeah,
I don't know how we can get that done.
Are you referring to the sidewalks getting to the bus stop?
No, not the sidewalks getting. I'm talking about the bus stop where it'd be a whole bunch of snow, like 3 or 4 feet of snow, and there's no shovel, and you have to go through there, and they have to pull out the ramp so you can get on it, or you have to like walk all the way through it, all the way in the snow just to get on the bus. Now, I'm not talking about riding the bus. I'm talking about trying to get on the bus, because we got to get on before we can, ride it.
Yeah. So you're talking about from the sidewalk to the curb and getting into the front door of the bus. There's sometimes like that drift of snow that the plows have pushed up onto the curb.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we talked about that actually in our previous session about amenities for our riders. And one potential solution would be kind of paving the area between the sidewalk and the curb and adding that to the portion of the bus stop that gets cleared by the property owner. That's definitely a long-term solution. But I would say if you're encountering issues of getting to the sidewalk and getting onto the bus stop, that's definitely something that we can help you follow up on. In some cases, it could just be a reminder to the property owner that they need to clear that area. We try to send out every winter a little postcard for people that live near bus stops that we remind them, people do rely on clear access to the bus stop here. So usually that's enough to remind people to clear it. But if there's an issue, we can help follow up with that. Because the city does have ways to notify a property owner of their responsibility to clear the sidewalk.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So and I would just say, well, I was pulling that up. I would just say, Billy, I I would suggest certainly calling our customer service, or we can stay online a little bit after this meeting. We'd love to hear kind of specific areas where you're having that issue. Would be helpful for us to follow up.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple other things that I wanted to mention here, principles that we try to keep in mind as we plan out our routes. So I've got an illustration here where there's two different lines that technically are the same length from A to B. One is a straight line, and the other is kind of a squiggly little spaghetti looking line, you could say. And so something important to keep in mind is as we're planning our routes, both of these would cost the same to operate because they're the same length. But one of them takes you a lot further from left to right than the other. So we tend to try to design routes that are more straight because it has that benefit of helping people travel more directly to where they're headed. The route on the bottom probably does look familiar because we have quite a few routes in our system that aren't a straight line. And sometimes that's because the street network doesn't really allow for a straight line to get through. But in other cases, there's opportunities to improve and streamline. So just something that we keep in mind as we plan our routes. Another thing to be aware of is when we're designing bus routes, we try to find routes that are high levels of activity at every stop. And so there's two different examples here. The one on the bottom shows every bus stop having kind of a higher level or a consistent level of ridership and activity. And the other line shows several bus stops where there's no activity. And so in that case, there may be an important destination at the end of the line, but you have to drive a couple miles through lower productivity areas to get there. And again, these two routes would cost the same to operate, but the one on the bottom would be more effective and higher ridership because it's a more consistent corridor that it's serving. So these are some of the challenges that we face in a city that's already built out and that's growing, not always in consistent ways. It does kind of create some gaps at times of areas that need service, but there's not an efficient way to serve them. The last slide that I have here is just kind of a description of generally different service types that we offer. So on the top, we have our local service that typically just has the blue sign at the stops, and they're a little bit closer together. On this slide, it says every 2 to 3 blocks, in some cases closer than that. And those routes run about every 30 minutes, maybe every hour, and really are designed to get into the neighborhoods and help people connect in some of those closer destinations. Our next level of service is our frequent lines. And so those stops are probably going to be spaced a little bit further apart. And we do try to identify locations for nicer shelters. And that service is going to run typically every 15 minutes, at least during rush hour. And those routes are typically concentrated on some of our higher ridership areas. And then the highest ridership areas, we try to offer this new service, which right now we have only on Dodge Street, but our orbit lines have stations that are quite a bit further apart than a local route. They run every 10 minutes, so the wait time is pretty short, and the stations have nice amenities. So even though you may walk a little bit further to get there, the experience once you get there is much faster and much more streamlined. So generally, these are kind of the 3 approaches that we have to bus service that we offer. There will be, and there are examples that are kind of a blend of some of these, but just wanted to show that in case it's helpful. So at this point, we wanted to kind of pause and ask a question of our audience. Of all the ways that we could improve, we're trying to hear from riders, what would cause you to ride the bus more often? Would you like to see more frequent arrivals on our existing routes? more evening and weekend service on existing routes, more options for park and ride service, or routes to new areas. And feel free to unmute and answer the question when you're ready. You can also answer in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. And also, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask those at this time.
So I know it's a tough question. We're asking everybody to choose one, or at least what would be most important on that. It looks like Andrew's got his hand raised.
Yep. So my primary question would be on some of the routes, more specifically the local routes, such as in like Route 14, or even like on the less serviced routes, such as in like Route 16, where it's only servicing the Epley airfield like during 2 times of the day during the weekdays. Is there ever the chance of a possibility of increasing those services? Granted, they are considered local services, so they do have more frequent stops. But even then, I think that Route 14 and Route 16 do share some similarities where they do have some highlights in them where they do connect to high traffic air locations. Route 16, for example, connects to the Epley airfield. I just think that it would be much more reasonable, in at least my perspective, that there is a more frequent bus connection to an airport, as a lot of metropolitan cities that I've been to in the past, they would have a constant bus service going from like 4 a.m. in the morning till almost midnight. And on a normal scale, granted, Omaha is not normal, it would be the best course of action to make sure that there is consistent service. Is that even a possibility that we could be looking into in the future?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So there's a lot of components that I'm thinking of as we consider the factors that influence that answer. So the short answer is yes, we could consider improvements anywhere. What we have to do as a community is kind of prioritize first, what are our highest or most important destinations that need more service than they have today. And we have heard during this process from quite a few people that say they would like to see higher levels of service to the airport. The Route 14 one is also important to lots of people. But since we can't, or I guess I shouldn't say we can't, but at this time, our budget doesn't allow us to increase service in multiple areas, or if it does, we may have to scale back the level of service somewhere else. So it's this constant rebalancing of our budget in terms of where we want to prioritize additional service. So another piece of that discussion is if we were to decide together that we need to have a higher budget for more transit service overall, then that does allow us to kind of raise the bar for service levels in multiple places. And so it makes it a little bit easier to decide where we prioritize that service. But as I said, that the first step is kind of figuring out how much money the community's comfortable spending on transit. And the second step, once we know that amount, is to really prioritize, okay, which areas can we all agree should have more service?
Yeah, and I would just add to that a little bit if I could, that really that's the whole point of why we're doing MetroNEXT, is we want that blueprint for how we should grow, which routes that don't exist should exist, which routes should have more service than they do now. Some, as Evan said, a few of these changes we might have the budget for now, but in a lot of them we don't. But we still think it's very important to plan for not just what we have now, but what we want to look like in the coming years. So that's the questions like yours are exactly the type of feedback we're trying to get through this whole process, so we can put together that strategic plan that makes sense and reflects the community's needs and wishes.
Yep. So with that, I think I might switch our screen to the activity that we have planned.
Let me just ask, does anybody else have anything that they wanted to share in terms of what priority would be the most important to them? And just to kind of maybe, oh, we do have a comment in the chat too from Mazine. So extension for service into places like Elkhorn or the MCC in Elkhorn is a really important.
Yeah, and actually that is a pretty nice transition to the map that we have here. So we've heard about service to Elkhorn, and that is something that we'll discuss here once we're ready to start the activity. But it looks like before that, maybe Andrew or even others have things that they want to add. So. Oh, okay. Andrew says he's good for now. I still saw the hand raised, so I wasn't sure.
And we're a small group, so if you want to raise your hand and unmute yourself, you're welcome to as well.
Yep. So with that, I'll kind of start explaining what we're seeing on the map here. So this is kind of a future map that we have of our system. And again, MetroNEXT is thinking 5 to 10 years in the future. So a lot of this may take a while to figure out. Right now, it's all still a draft, so things could still change. We want to hear your ideas. And so we produce this map as a way to get the conversation started. And Annie has shared a link to this map that you can pull up on your screen. And if you just look in the top right corner, there's this little button that says post comment. So if you click on that, it adds a little comment icon to your cursor. And so you can scroll in. So for example, we had the comment about service to Metro Community College in Elkhorn. You can scroll in and click on the Metro campus, write a comment. You can include your name if you'd like, or your email if you want a response. So if there's a specific question that you'd like us to respond to, that's a great way to do it. And I can email you back probably sometime next week. But you can also comment anonymously if you're more comfortable with that. All of these comments are public, so you can click and see, for example, Sally from our last meeting said that she loves seeing the MCC Elkhorn campus on the map here as a long-term plan. So just one more thing to explain. These lines here, you can click on them and add a comment specific to a route. So I've just clicked on the 97 Express, and you'll see that my cursor turns green to match the color of Route 97. So that way, if I want to comment specifically about that route, the comment will be tied back to the route itself. So just a couple explanations. You're welcome to start adding comments anywhere you'd like to. Whether that's, yes, I agree, this looks good, or have you ever thought of blank, or I would really like to see improvements in this area, and your map hasn't considered that yet. So just to further explain what we're looking at, we've got the orbit line in orange, and that shows up on Dodge Street. You'll also see that 24th is showing as a dashed orange line to represent that we are in the process, or just kind of starting the process of studying what it might look like for orbit or some other transit upgrade to be installed on 24th Street. Yeah, we'll be talking more about that in the meetings after Thanksgiving. So I won't spend too much more time on that today. But we've also got in this gold color, the frequent routes highlighted. And so those are the ones, like I mentioned, that run about every 15 minutes during rush hour. And many of you may be familiar with those already. And then the blue routes show our local service that runs between every 30 and 60 minutes usually. And most of those lines are areas that you'll recognize. So feel free to comment on those. We also have some boxes identified that show areas where we haven't really decided yet what type of service best meets the need for that area. So this one, for example, is kind of west of West Roads. The Social Security office on Route 14 is included in here, as well as Burke High School. And so it goes generally from Blondo to Pacific, almost as far as 144th Street. And that's kind of a zone that we've heard from lots of people that they'd like to see new service there. And so we're working during this process to identify what that might look like. You'll also see a similar zone kind of drawn for the Millard area. And that goes from 84th roughly to Harrison, 138th Street on the west, and almost Center Street on the north side. And again, we're kind of looking further, still not sure what the best solution is going to be for that area. In Sarpy County, we've identified areas like that for La Vista. So from PayPal and Cabela's all the way to 84th and Giles. And we also have a zone like that for Bellevue. And this is a little bit more broad. It goes as far south as the Air Force Base. It includes downtown Bellevue and some of the other areas that historically had transit service and don't anymore, aside from the Bellevue Express, which is shown with this green route. We've also got an area identified in South Omaha, south of Q Street to Harrison, between about 60th and 13th. That's also an area that over the years has had multiple different community circulators, and today is served by the Route 24, but we're still kind of thinking through and brainstorming the best way to serve that community. We've also got a zone identified in North Omaha near the airport, and including some of these industrial businesses like Logier and others that are up north of the airport. We've also heard from the business park up on McKinley Street, up in Florence, that there's quite a few workers that are trying to reach this area to the west of Route 30. And the route just barely doesn't take them as far as they'd like it to go. So we're still, again, kind of puzzling through the best ways to solve that problem. So as you look at the full picture, the green routes are express service. And if it's a dotted line, that means it's proposed new service potentially. And the solid lines are routes that exist already. So we've got, as a proposed service, a new express route that would serve La Vista as a park and ride and Gretna. And so that would really kind of meet the need of commuters, whether they're coming from Lincoln or Waverly or Gretna itself, folks that may work downtown or need access to West Roads, and they could park and ride that service on weekdays. Before the pandemic started, we were already at work planning a route like this for Fort Street that would originate as far west as 156th and Fort, with several park and rides along Fort Street, and then take the interstate to the West Roads Transit Center. And those plans were starting to come together right as COVID took effect, and then all of that got put on hold. So we still think it's a good idea that should be considered further once the dust settles and people are kind of back to commuting in regular ways. To explain a little bit more about the gray dotted lines that show on this map, those are corridors that we have evaluated for frequent or rapid service in the future. And so you can see 144th Street is one of those. We've got the North Belt Line, 72nd Street. Let's see, First Avenue in Council Bluffs, 72nd, all the way down to South Roads, or not South Roads, Shadow Lake Town Center. Fort Crook and Bellevue, those are all lines that we're considering for rapid service in the future, but they're far enough away that in this plan, we're just kind of acknowledging that they need to be studied, but we won't be able to fully dive into some of these until we get further into the future. So with that, again, we're just inviting any feedback on this map, any suggestions, ideas, or concerns. So you can either click on the map and add those notes, or you can just unmute yourself and we can have a conversation now.
I would just add one little piece of context too. So we have obviously shown a lot of areas that are outside the city of Omaha on this map because we think it's important to think regionally and how we can grow. There's stuff in Sarpy County, but as of right now, it's just we are the transit authority of the city of Omaha. So our jurisdiction is really only within the city of Omaha limits. Anything outside of the city, our city, is really designed and kind of paid for by those other cities. But we want to think bigger picture. This is a vision. This is what we want it to look like, not just the current constraints, but it's just something to keep in mind. And it looks like Billy maybe is unmuted.
Yeah, I had a question about the UMO, new machines and everything, and people needing to get on. I'm thinking that, well, if it's too much confusion in trying to work that new UMO machine and everything, that's gonna cause people not to want to ride the bus, as well. But I had a problem with my ticket, and I got a change ticket for $124, and it was just going crazy, and it charged me $250 just to get. I only want to put it $3 on my card, on one of my UMO disability card, and I just wanted to put the $3 on there, but it went up to $250. But it didn't charge my card, my debit card, luckily, because I didn't have that much. So I was just wondering that if this becomes difficult for the customers, or you think maybe, like, I don't know, suggest a meeting on how to get that understood more, because I did get a change ticket for $124, and if I cash it in, I don't know about cashing these change tickets in like this. See, so this is what we have to use now on the new bus services. So it's going to take a lot of patience for that, but
Yeah.
and
so
I was just,
sorry to hear that you've had so many difficult issues with those new machines. We have tried to have ambassadors out helping people learn the new equipment, but I agree with you. It's pretty daunting at first to learn that. So do you recall what station you were at when you had the experience where it charged you that much?
I think I was on 33rd.
Oh, okay.
33rd and what's the name? I don't know if it's not on here.
33rd and Dodge, probably.
Yeah, going towards West Road. I was headed home, and I had to go towards West Road to get home. And I was on, I think that was the one I was on, and it just went crazy. And it charged me $250. There's a ticket right there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you were able to cancel that before the process or the transaction fully went through.
So I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm gonna go and ask them how do I get my money back? So, but on the $3, but I didn't pay the. It just tells you that's how much the ticket is worth. So I don't know how that's gonna work. So I just thought I bring that up because getting on the bus is just as important. Trying to get on the bus and paying the fare is just as important as riding the bus.
For sure.
So I just thought maybe.
So in terms of fares and things like that, we are going to have some meetings after Thanksgiving that'll be more on that topic. But Billy, if you don't mind staying on after this, I do want to get your contact information and have one of my experts on UMO call you next week, if that's okay. So
okay.
We don't want to do it right now in the public setting, but I'll definitely want to get your contact information for afterwards so we can get that resolved for you.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions or reactions to the map here from today's discussion? Yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
So 2 quick comments here, and I also did post one of them on the map already. Regarding the first, I think you might have muted me of a mistake, but oh well.
Sorry.
Regarding the First Avenue and Broadway extension, or not necessarily extension, but route itself, I think that might actually be useful in another sense, using it as an extension to the current orbit. having it run up there, because I know that was a planned idea that MAPPA had evaluated a couple years back after Orbit had launched, something like that. Because I remember, well, maybe not a couple years, but I think a couple months ago, I want to say, when MAPPA released like a press document about transit evaluation in the Council Bluffs and the Omaha metropolitan area. I saw that was an extension service that could be useful. But then again, that's purely speculation at that point. I think that that First Avenue and Broadway extension could actually be very useful for Orbit. And then just on the second comment that I have regarding the Gretna Express, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a Gretna Express, since it only goes to, what is that, a Highway 285 or right? Am I right on that? I think that's, where is that?
370.
370,
is what it's called.
I don't believe that would be a good enough like distance for people that are coming from Gretna. Let's say somebody doesn't have a vehicle or doesn't have access to a way to get to the park and ride that would most likely be made there. Then what at that point? Would they have to go ahead and walk? Because I know that the distance from Highway 370 and I-80 to the actual in town of Gretna is quite a distance.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that could be extended upon or not at the moment?
No, that's a good point. I think the intention at this time was just to say that we want to have a park and ride that could serve the Gretna community, but it would kind of assume that folks here that use it would drive and park closer to the interstate. Because adding the extra mileage for the bus to get to Gretna, we would be kind of passing through several miles of undeveloped area, which referencing back to our conversation earlier, we try to avoid that when possible to consolidate service into the most efficient pickup points. So yeah, maybe calling it the Gretna Express is misleading. But the intention here is to have a park and ride that is close to the interstate and kind of pulls people from those communities.
I mean, I think we could, I mean, all of these are really just kind of rough lines on a map now, and really Metro's suggestions of things that need to be studied and evaluated and considered. So we're happy to consider that comment about looking at the termini of that route or any of these routes. There was a reason it was put there. And I think, like Evan said, it would be a lot of resources driving through kind of unused areas that are resources that couldn't be put somewhere else. But, you know, any of this is really just very first thoughts, rough ideas. And that's the whole reason we're having this conversation, is to get that feedback and refine them when we need to.
Okay.
Great. Any other comments? If not, then we will kind of wrap things up here. So our next set of meetings is going to be after Thanksgiving, either Tuesday, November 30th at 6 p.m. or Thursday, December 2nd over the lunch hour, starting at 12:30. And both of those meetings will be on the topic of our future rapid transit network. So we're excited to talk more about 24th Street, as well as some of these other corridors that are kind of on our radar for building out a more substantial regional network of rapid transit. So we hope you're able to tune into those. We did have rider amenity meetings last week that if you missed, the recording is on our website. Be sure to check that out and stay tuned to our MetroNEXT website at ometro.com/MetroNEXT. You're welcome to follow us on social media if you want to engage with us that way, through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. And those are all great ways to get in touch with us if you think of other comments.